In this mini tutorial, I'm going to provide you with a detailed overview of the parasympathetic nervous system. And we're going to do this by, first of all, drawing a very simple diagram of the entire central nervous system. So here is the spinal cord with the medulla, the pons and the midbrain. Here are our cerebral hemispheres with the midbrain, the pons and the medulla, and going down into the spinal cord itself. So there's an overview of the entire central nervous system. And you should recall from previous mini tutorials that the parasympathetics emerge essentially from the two ends of the CNS, from the brainstem or from the lower part of the spinal cord. So let's deal with the parasympathetics emerging from the upper part of the CNS first. And you'll recall that there are four cranial nerves which contain parasympathetic fibres. And the first cranial nerve which I want to draw your attention to is the third nerve, which emerges from the midbrain. And here is a parasympathetic preganglionic neuron which is going to contribute to our third nerve. Alright, so this is in the oculomotor nerve, the third nerve here. And this long parasympathetic preganglionic is going to synapse upon a parasympathetic postganglionic, which is then going to supply various structures in the eye. Okay? And the synapse occurs in a ganglion. We've talked about ganglia before. This ganglion has a specific name. It is known as the ciliary ganglion. So this is the ciliary ganglion, which is responsible for providing parasympathetic postganglionics to the eye. The second cranial nerve, which contains parasympathetic fibres, is the facial nerve. And the facial nerve actually supplies two different ganglia. So this is the facial nerve, cranial nerve 7, and it synapses in two separate ganglia. One ganglion supplies the lacrimal gland, and the second ganglion supplies two salivary glands, the submandibular and the sublingual salivary glands. The ganglion which supplies the lacrimal gland has quite a long name. It's known as the pterygopalatine ganglion, the pterygopalatine ganglion. And the ganglion which supplies those two salivary glands is known as the submandibular ganglion. So there we have the two ganglia where we have parasympathetic synapses provided by parasympathetic preganglionics from the facial nerve. The next cranial nerve which contains parasympathetics is the glossopharyngeal nerve. So that's cranial nerve 9. And the glossopharyngeal nerve supplies parasympathetics to the parotid gland. So that's the large salivary gland at the side of your face. And the ganglion where the synapse occurs is known as the otic ganglion. Now, you need to look up in an atlas where these ganglia are to be found, but if ever you get stuck, just remember one of the rules of the parasympathetic nervous system, which is that the ganglion occurs either in the wall of the target organ or very, very close to the target organ. So these ganglia are going to be occupying a very similar region to the region in which the target organ is to be found. Now, the fourth nerve, which contains parasympathetics, is of course the vagus. But the vagus has such a widespread distribution that it doesn't really synapse in named ganglia. It kind of goes all over the place, and frequently its ganglia are in the walls of its target organs. So, for example, in the walls of the airways or in the walls of the gut. So there is no particular name for the ganglia that the vagus synapses in, and its targets are various. So there are many targets that the vagus has. Just before we move on and consider the sacral parasympathetics, I just want to briefly explain to you how the parasympathetics find their way into the cranial nerves. I don't think you need to worry about the specific details of this, but just to appreciate a simple principle. And that principle is that many of the cranial nerves contain axons which have different origins. And I'm going to try to explain this by using the third nerve as an example. Now, the third nerve emerges from the midbrain, so this is the midbrain here, which I've just drawn. And here is the point at which the third nerve emerges from the midbrain, and that's the third nerve itself proper. Now, as you should know from the basic tutorial on cranial nerve function, the third nerve has two major roles. It supplies certain muscles which move the eye, and it contains parasympathetic fibres. And those two different types of fibre take their origin from two different places. So the parasympathetic fibres originate from a discrete group of cell bodies in the midbrain, known as the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. Now, you don't need to worry about that name specifically at this point, but just appreciate that the parasympathetics originate from one area of the midbrain, and they send their axons into the third nerve. The motor neurons, which supply the extraocular muscles, originate from a separate part of the midbrain, known as the oculomotor nucleus. But those axons go into the third nerve alongside the parasympathetic axons. So the third nerve is a mixed nerve, and it's mixed because its axons are originating from different locations within the brainstem. And that's what's happening with the other cranial nerves as well. They contain mixed populations of axons which originate from diverse places within the brainstem itself. So now let's consider the sacral parasympathetics, and I'm going to draw here diagrammatically a cell body of a parasympathetic preganglionic neuron down in the sacral cord, and we know that this parasympathetic preganglionic neuron can be found in the region between cord levels S2 and S4. Okay? These parasympathetics from the sacral cord typically supply pelvic structures, pelvic viscera, such as the bladder or the reproductive organs. So they supply pelvic viscera. And the ganglia for these parasympathetic preganglionics don't have names. once again, they're in the walls of the target organs, arranged quite diffusely. Now, the way in which these parasympathetic preganglionics are distributed is quite interesting. Let's just draw a cross-section of the sacral spinal cord. So there's the sacral cord, central canal, dorsal horn, lateral horn, ventral horn, lateral horn, dorsal horn. You probably haven't encountered the term lateral horn in relation to parasympathetics before. I'm using it. Some books call it the intermediolateral cell column, which is effectively equivalent to the lateral horn in the thoracic cord. Suffice it to say that whenever you see this additional lateral bump in the grey matter of the cord, this is the location of autonomic preganglionic neurons. So this is meant to be a section of sacral cord. So this is sacral, and what we've got in the sacral cord, as in any segment of the cord, we have got roots. So we've got a dorsal root with a dorsal root ganglion. We've got a ventral root, and then we've got a spinal nerve formed just there. Now, the parasympathetic preganglionics, which I'm going to draw in green, as we've said, their cell bodies can be found in this lateral horn of the sacral cord. Their axon then passes into the ventral horn, just like the sympathetics, and into the spinal nerve. But then what happens is that they don't run the full length of the spinal nerve, as in the sympathetic system. What they actually do is exit the spinal nerve and then go on to supply the pelvic viscera, obviously with a synapse in between. And this structure which emerges from the spinal nerve here is known as the pelvic splanchnic nerve. And of course there are many of these on both sides. So the pelvic splanchnic nerves are the parasympathetic preganglionic supply for the pelvic viscera. And if you look in a good quality atlas, you should be able to see these pelvic splanchnics emerging anteriorly from the sacral spinal nerves. So I hope this has been of some use to you. You should watch this in conjunction with the basic mini tutorials on autonomic nervous system, as well as the detailed overview of the sympathetic system, in order to compare and contrast the two areas. Okay, thank you.